Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
A young brunette kissed the elderly gray-haired woman who was sitting at the table on the cheek and promised, "I'll be back quickly today, Mom. I managed to do a thorough cleaning yesterday, so only the usual little things are left for today. As soon as I finish, I'll run to the pharmacy and then straight home." "Don't rush, Renita," the woman replied. "Take a walk, relax. Why do you always fuss around with me? I can manage here, don't worry. Little by little, I'm managing around the house. So, hunger is not a threat to me. If I'm up to it, I might even do a little gardening. And you can take the evening bus to the city. Go to the movies or shopping. Seriously, how long have you been wearing the same jeans?" The brunette shook her head and answered, "I'll have a day off, and we'll have a walk around the city together. Going to the movies or shopping alone is not much fun." Irene glanced at her simple phone screen. She kissed her companion again and rushed out of the house. The weather was good, so the woman decided to save money and walk to work. It was only about a 40-minute walk through the streets and forest paths that had dried up after the snow had melted. Irene walked briskly and rhythmically, sinking into thoughts about the twists and turns of her own fate. Her parents tragically died during a river rafting trip, which was advertised as a simple and enjoyable outing in nature, leaving a 6-year-old girl an orphan. She didn't even know her grandparents from both sides. Her mother grew up in an orphanage, and due to unfortunate circumstances with her father's parents, they hadn't even had a chance to celebrate the birth of their granddaughter. Irene was taken into the care of her father's older brother. Uncle Pablo was a good person, but due to his constant busyness, he was hardly ever at home. He was working hard to earn money so that his wife Adeleda, sons Francisco and Santiago, and later, the orphaned niece, lacked nothing. Although the apartment and the people she was to live with after the tragedy were familiar to her, scared, lost, and tearful little Irene was bewildered, and for a while, she didn't communicate with anyone. She couldn't come to terms with the changes that had taken place. The girl was silent almost all the time, even in her familiar daycare center. Although it wasn't very convenient to get there from her uncle's house, Adeleda didn't show any displeasure over having to adjust her daily routine to accommodate dropping off and picking up the girl from preschool. The caregiver, genuinely concerned for the orphan, worried that the changes in Irene's character, from a cheerful, active chatterbox to a reclusive loner, would be irreversible. However, the girl managed to adapt to the new environment. To Adelaida's credit, she played a significant role in creating comfort for Irene. The woman treated the unexpectedly appeared little relative with unwavering politeness. She was never begrudging a crust of bread, as they say. She hugged, praised, and encouraged Irene for even the smallest successes. Adelaida tried to involve the girl in household chores, as advised by a friend who was interested in psychology. But she didn't overburden her. Adelaida didn't mistreat the girl. She sewed her skirts, dresses, and braided her hair. In her childhood, Irene thought that her uncle's wife was too demanding of her and didn't really love her. The woman didn't call her daughter, but as she grew older, she understood how right Adelaida was in not wanting to replace her mother. The wise woman helped the girl preserve her memories of her parents. Irene now understood clearly that her uncle's wife's compassion was genuine love. Adelaida, with all the strength of her compassionate and truly motherly soul, tried to ensure that the girl didn't feel dispossessed. Being a fair and conscientious person, the woman never made any distinctions between her husband's niece and her own sons. The emotional warmth that all children needed, Irene fully felt from Uncle Pablo. In his free time, he gladly took his sons and niece to the amusement park, bought them treats and small souvenirs. He was the one who played around with all the kids, while Adelaida stayed in the background, providing a comfortable household. Paco and Yago, the mischievous boys who were 4 and 3 years older than their cousin, didn't pay her much attention. They considered her too young to deserve much respect, especially since they had to share a room because of her. However, Irene was fine with that. She tried to be as helpful as possible, grateful that she wasn't sent to an orphanage. The girl became part of the family. When Irene started school, her cousins suddenly became her best friends and protectors. Of course, around others, they treated her with condescension. But they helped her with her studies and dealt with bullies who bothered her, ensuring a peaceful life for their cousin. For several years, everything was great. The smooth road section was replaced by an uphill slope, and in unison with that, Irene's memories approached a difficult moment. The prosperity of the family that had taken her in turned out to be fragile. Its destruction was caused by the death of Francisco, who was sent to a hot spot to serve. As best as the 15-year-old girl could, she tried to support Adelita, Uncle Pablo, and Iago, who mourned his older brother. In fact, Irene took on all the household chores, which the mother who lost her son disregarded. Iago wanted revenge, but due to a chronic illness, he couldn't join the army. After some thought, he began preparing intensively for admission to medical school. And he succeeded. Irene also had plans to become a doctor, but another misfortune struck. Less than 40 days after Paco's funeral, Uncle Pablo, who was deeply affected by the loss, suffered a heart attack and died. It was painful to watch Adelita. Sometimes Irene felt that the unhappy woman looked at her and wouldn't recognize not only her, but even her own son. The family's financial situation deteriorated significantly, so after completing the 9th grade, Irene enrolled in a vocational school to quickly acquire a profession and started working part-time wherever she could. It turned out to be very fortunate that Irene had nimble hands and exceptional patience. Even the most meticulous sewing operations didn't provoke apathy or anger in her, only a desire to do everything as well as possible. The girl took pride in the fact that she could no longer be called a dependent and took on the responsibility of buying groceries and household chemicals. Of course, she understood that Adelita carried the majority of the financial burden. But she tried to at least ease her life. Iago also didn't sit idle. Alongside his studies, he managed to get a job at the ambulance station. This quick-witted guy, even without a completed education, was happily given simple tasks, and then they even started sending him out on calls. It did bend the rules a bit, of course, but in a shortage of personnel, there was no reason to waste such determined employees. So, they lived as a trio. And a completely unexpected piece of news came for Santiago and Irene after 3 years of Adelita's tragic loss of her son and husband. Adelita revealed her intentions to remarry. The plan was practically finalized. Irene understood that under such circumstances, her presence might be awkward for the family. Irene mentioned her desire to move into her parents' apartment, which had been rented out to some old acquaintances of Adelita. The girl had reached adulthood, and this idea met no resistance. Soon, with the help of Iago, Adelita, and her then-fiancé, Dario, Irene settled into the place where she had once been so happy with her parents. She vaguely remembered that there was a market nearby where they sold both groceries and items. On the first day after the move, she went to rediscover the places of her early childhood. She discovered a section that had been transformed into a mini atelier. Quick alterations to pants, shortening skirts or dresses, inserting zippers, or performing minor repairs, this was the range of services provided to customers. Although Irene didn't expect there to be a spot for her, she decided to inquire about job vacancies. And luck was on her side. A heavily pregnant seamstress, after listening to Irene, asked her to demonstrate her skills on a small piece of fabric. Irene's level of expertise was quite high, and the seamstress, who turned out to be the owner of the mini atelier, gave her a chance to work in her place. It was at this job that Irene met her future husband. Carlos wandered into the modest little shop almost by chance. The zipper on his relatively new jacket had broken. Driving past the market, he noticed the unassuming sign. At the visitor's request, Irene completed the requested task urgently. She never expected the man to appear at the door the next day. That meeting still echoed sweetly in Irene's heart. The 25-year-old man seemed so mature, serious, and thoughtful to her. He quickly won her heart with beautiful compliments and stories about his wonderful parents who lived in the countryside. Even the young girl didn't expect herself to invite her beloved to live with her. After such a proposal, Carlos said everything should be done properly. He organized a gathering where the closest people came together. From Irene's side, Adelita, her husband, and Iago were present. And Carlos himself and his parents, Senora Gallego and Senor Gallego. They all liked each other. Adelita, seizing the moment, whispered to Irene that Carlos's family was very respectable, hardworking, and principled. She wished the girl love and mutual understanding. The radiant bride was grateful for such support from her only family. The time until the wedding celebration flew by in an instant, which they made pleasant and heartfelt by mutual decision. Irene, perhaps for the first time, saw how Adelita twirled in a dance and was pleasantly surprised by her cousin's moving speech. Santiago, usually not talkative, outdid himself and elicited a unanimous applause from all present. The parents of her beloved husband embraced Irene as their own daughter. She never had battles for Carlos's attention or kitchen dominance with her mother-in-law. Occasionally, Senora Gallego, leaving her rural household to her husband, came to the city for a few days and stayed with her son and daughter-in-law, causing neither annoyance nor awkwardness. The woman rejoiced in watching the nimble young lady, who was working hard to make their home cozy and pleasant. Once, as Irene remembered it now, they were making pies together, and seeing that her mother-in-law was about to brush her elbow against the handle of the pot containing eggs for the filling, Irene blurted out, "Oh, Mom, be careful with the pot." The woman moved away from the dangerous object and, approaching the flustered Irene, gently embraced her. "Don't worry, dear, don't be embarrassed. Call me as you feel comfortable. As your heart desires." Irene didn't hesitate to come to the village on weekends to help her husband's parents. Of course, she lacked much experience as a 19-year-old city dweller. But this shortcoming was more than compensated for by her diligence and willingness to absorb new knowledge. However, her mother-in-law and father-in-law didn't overwhelm the bride. Senor Gallego advised, "Daughter, the heat of the garden isn't the place for you. It's better to run down to the river with Carlito." Senora Gallego supported her husband. "Right, everything will get done by evening." In their blissful family life, the first setbacks began, roughly, a year after the wedding. The market where Irene worked at the mini atelier was decided to be demolished and replaced with a high-rise building on the freed-up territory. The young woman was left without a job. She unsuccessfully tried to find any nearby vacancies and made ends meet by fulfilling various orders at home. Simultaneously, problems also started at the logistics firm where Carlos worked. Irene had to cut back, but she jokingly referred to the forced renunciation of delicacies like bacon for breakfast or smoked sausage as transitioning to a healthier diet. One day, Carlos suggested, "Irene, due to the upcoming construction of the high-rises, the value of your apartment will rapidly decrease. While there's still time, I think we urgently need to sell it and get another place. Otherwise, we'll end up at the center of the noise, and it's not certain that the building will peacefully withstand the construction work nearby." Irene didn't want to part with her family apartment. Adelita, whom she turned to for advice, recommended not getting worked up. "Irene, here's the thing. Right now, the apartment is yours, but the one you'll buy with the proceeds from selling it will be jointly acquired property. I don't want to think or talk about Carlos, but life isn't a walk in the park. Who knows what might happen? After all, circumstances can vary." Wise Adelita saw it like in crystal, but how could Irene refuse her husband? Against the advice of her distant relative, the woman sold the apartment that had belonged to her parents. But then everything turned into a nightmare. Carlos and she found another apartment, and even though it was almost the same size as the previous one, they had to take out a mortgage. The payment amount wasn't critical, but it didn't allow them to step out of the economy mode. However, that wasn't yet a disaster. Soon after the housewarming, Carlos disappeared. He simply left for work in the morning and didn't return in the evening. Irene called all the husband's acquaintances, and that's when it became clear that Carlos hadn't shown up at work. The police received her with little warmth and almost bluntly informed her that they wouldn't accept any missing person reports. They said, "It's a young case. The man got tired of family life, went on a spree." Although Irene managed to stand her ground, the investigation couldn't establish anything substantial. Gathering bits of collected information, it turned out that Carlos had exited the subway station a few stops before the one nearest to his workplace and headed toward the industrial zone. There were very few cameras in that area, and so, on a calm sunny morning just a few weeks before their second wedding anniversary, the man disappeared. Irene never stopped believing that her husband was alive, and she tried her best to find him. However, neither the police nor the private detective she hired with borrowed money could provide any answers. The main theory was about a mistress, but no evidence of Carlos's infidelity could be found. A more plausible motive seemed to be disappearance due to a complex situation at work, where allegedly a serious mistake had been made due to Carlos's fault, leading to significant losses. However, the management of the logistics company somehow managed to convince investigators of their non-involvement. After Carlos disappeared, his parents fell ill. Alternating between the hospital, Senor Gallego and his spouse lost their zest for life. Luckily, by that time, Santiago had started his residency, and he gathered information through acquaintances and recommended the best doctors in the necessary specialization. Under Yago's attentive mentorship, Irene learned how to give injections, and for a while, she commuted between the city and the village since her mother-in-law and father-in-law adamantly refused to move. "Daughter, oh, how can we leave the house? Especially since all the conditions are met here. And as they say, familiar walls have a healing effect. What are we going to do in the city, like sitting in a cage? After all, whether you like it or not, we need to go outside for fresh air and naturally feel invigorated. Carlos, when he returns, will definitely guess that you're here with us." Senor Gallego persuaded the bride to move to the village. Of course, Irene understood that she didn't have much room for maneuver. One could say that circumstances made a difficult choice for her. Her husband's parents needed support, including financial support. In this situation, the woman couldn't afford to pay mortgage payments, and she also had to repay the credit taken out in desperation. Even if the bank, considering Carlos's disappearance, were to accommodate her and reduce the amount of the monthly payment, it would only prolong her personal financial agony. It was fortunate that Adelaida not only didn't rush her to repay the debt, but even helped to cover one of the urgent payments. "Renita, I know that you're proud. But, please, don't refuse. I can see that you're at the limit of your strength right now. So, you'll push yourself too hard. Still, consider Carlos's parents' offer. I'll find someone to rent your apartment so you won't have to chase rent and do repairs later. It'll be some kind of support." Having waited for the doctors to decide on discharging Senora Gallego, who once again ended up in the hospital, Irene accompanied her mother-in-law home and informed her that she had decided to move in with them. It seemed that this news lifted everyone's spirits. Money started coming in from the rent of Irene's apartment, and besides, she started sewing. As a result, she could pay off the mortgage and loans. Also, she looked after Senora and Senor Gallego. Of course, everything would have been fine if it weren't for the persistent thoughts about Carlos, who had disappeared. From these terrible worries, one morning after the anniversary of Carlos's disappearance without a trace, Irene's father-in-law simply didn't wake up. Senora Gallego, having buried her husband, became seriously ill. For 2 long years, Irene struggled to help Senora Gallego recover. Fortunately, thanks to Yago's hints about where to turn, she was able to assist her mother-in-law. When Senora Gallego was back on her feet and could move around confidently, Irene realized she could leave home and started working at a mansion in the nearby cottage village. So, for almost 2 years, she has been serving as a housekeeper, maid, and seamstress all in one. The salary is paid in cash, of course. There's no sick leave or vacation provided. But otherwise, they treat her fairly, and the threat of poverty for Irene and Senora Gallego has receded. If only Carlos could come back, and if only he were alive. Then, in general, we could live happily, breathe fresh spring air, and not worry about anything else. With this thought, Irene approached the mansion, opened the gate with her magnetic key, and went to work. By 16 o'clock, When the homeowner Doña Molina returned from a shopping trip, Irene managed to complete everything she had planned and was already getting ready to leave. However, she had to stay a little longer. The employer asked her to alter the newly bought fashionable trousers by tomorrow morning. "Renita, my dear, help me out. At the tailor's shop where I stopped on the way, they said they couldn't do the alteration urgently. But you're so skilled. Will you do it, my friend? I'll pay you for the extra work, of course, but the trousers must be ready by 9 in the morning tomorrow." For a skilled seamstress, such work is like the beginning of a tailoring business. Besides, Doña Molina promised a bonus, and Irene didn't hesitate to accept. After taking the necessary measurements, she waited for the homeowner to change her clothes. Then, carefully folding the branded item into a bag, she hurried over to her mother-in-law. For some reason, her heart was uneasy. The estimated taxi arrival time given by the dispatcher was only 5 minutes faster than if Irene had walked. She decided it was better to run than wait with an uncertain outcome. This had happened several times during the past winter. The ordered taxi simply didn't show up, and alternative ways had to be devised. But this time, there was no slush or snowdrifts, and there should be at least another 2 hours of daylight left. So, the woman literally ran along the familiar road. The roof of the mother-in-law's house was already visible from the hill where Irene stood. Suddenly, from behind the pine trees, she heard a voice that, despite the unfamiliar lisp, she wouldn't mistake for 100 others. "Hello, Renita." Undoubtedly, it was Carlos speaking, the return of whom Irene had been hoping for these almost 5 years. However, Irene wasn't too inclined to believe her ears anymore. In the quiet of the night, she had already imagined her beloved's voice multiple times, but it always turned out to be a mere illusion that her tormented heart desperately wanted to believe in. Turning sharply, the woman peered in the direction of the sound, fearing another mistake. Her eyes widened, and the bag containing the homeowner's trousers fell onto the path, slipping from her suddenly weakened hands. Near the tree, indeed, stood Carlos. Thin, with a beard, clearly not in the same clothes in which she had last seen him off to work. But still, it was her husband. Overwhelmed with joy, Irene rushed to her beloved and began to cry, not holding back her sobs. "Carlos, is that really you? Say something. Where have you been? You're not a figment of my imagination, are you?" The woman asked and begged through her tears, tightly embracing Carlos as if fearing he might dissolve into thin air. With reassuring gestures, the man stroked his wife's back, and when her sobbing subsided, he spoke with an unusual lisp. "Let's go home. It would be good to eat and freshen up, then I'll tell you everything." Irene, as if awakening, nodded her head. "Of course, dear. I'm not myself from happiness." Holding her husband's hand tightly, Irene was about to head towards the village, but Carlos stopped her, reminding her. "Renita, you dropped some sort of bag on the path there. Maybe there's something important inside?" Not letting go of her husband's hand, Irene picked up the bag, struggling to control her desire to embrace her beloved again, and trying to focus on the fact that, above all, he needed to be fed. Later, as they walked to the village, the woman was nervously choosing her words so as not to overly distress her mother-in-law with the news of her returned son. An appropriate way to convey the message just wouldn't come to mind. If she said, "Mom, don't worry," Senora Gallego would become even more nervous, which was strongly discouraged. Maybe she could announce it like this: "Mommy, we have good news." Or say it directly: "Carlos is back. Oh Lord, how do I tell him that his father couldn't bear the separation?" Irene's agonizing thoughts were interrupted by Carlos's voice. "How did you manage without me? How is my parents' health?" From the prolonged silence, Carlos guessed that not everything was going well at home. And he asked, concerned, "Is it father who's ill or mother?" Tears welled up in Irene's eyes again, but she found the strength to say. Senor Gallego's heart stopped. Almost 4 years ago, they laid him to rest. She felt Carlos tense up at this news. But they were already at the gate of the house, so Irene hurried to warn him. Mother's health isn't great either. So, Carlito, wait a few minutes. I'll prepare a sedative and let her know that we have good news." The man agreed with his wife's idea and sat on the porch, which he himself had recently repaired with his father shortly before his disappearance. "Renita, my dear." The mother-in-law's voice came from the kitchen. "It seemed to me that you didn't enter the yard alone. Who's come to visit?" Irene understood that her mother-in-law had most likely seen Carlos, but like her, was afraid that it was just a hallucination. "We have good news, Mom." The woman confessed and shouted towards the door. "Come in, Carlito. Mom has apparently already seen you. You can't hide from a mother's heart." While Sonora Gallego hugged and kissed her son, who had returned from the unknown, her daughter-in-law busied herself with dinner and, as a precaution, prepared a glass of a calming remedy for her mother-in-law. "Mommy, take a brief break from Carlito. Please, drink the medicine, and I'll prepare laundry and clean clothes first." Carlos asked. "Renita, I'll take a shower today, and tomorrow let's heat up the bathhouse. I've been dreaming about it." "Of course, Carlito." Irene agreed. She was willing to do anything for her returned husband, but a sense of duty reminded her. "I'll just run over to the landlady in the morning, return her things, and ask for a day off. After all, I haven't requested one in almost 2 years. Maybe she'll be understanding? Oh, and I need to notify the police that Carlos has returned." Quickly gathering her husband's laundry and shaving supplies, Irene escorted him to the shower stall, warning, "The shower head is acting up a bit. If you turn the pressure on right away, it starts spraying in all directions. So, turn it on gently. I should replace it, but I haven't had the time." "Don't worry, my dear," Carlos kissed Irene on the cheek. "I'll handle it." Irene was a little surprised that her husband hadn't kissed her on the lips once, like he used to. And he even avoided her lips. However, Irene was too overjoyed to be saddened by this peculiar behavior of her returned husband. She attributed it to his shyness due to his slightly disheveled appearance and missing front tooth. Later, when the clean, freshly shaved, and weary man sat in his favorite armchair after a hearty dinner, Sonora Gallego couldn't hold back and asked, "Son, where were you all this time? Why did you disappear without warning anyone? What happened to you?" After taking a sip of tea from a large mug, Carlos paused for a moment and then began to explain. "At work, things were a mess. A deal went south that shouldn't have. Then the cargo on the road somehow became almost half as much. The inspection was a mess too. Good guys who had worked for the company from the ground up started scattering. The boss was furious, looking for someone to blame. He suspected that the competitors were involved in all of this. The day before I disappeared, he asked me to meet the truck with the cargo not at the unloading area, but in the industrial zone." Irene couldn't hold back and exclaimed, "Carlito, but why didn't you tell me about this? You were clearly lured into a trap." The man smiled, revealing the gap where a tooth was missing, and spread his arms. "Renita, what would you have done? How would you have helped? I took what I thought were all the precautions. I intentionally left the keys behind, as if I forgot them, so that the criminals couldn't break into the apartment and scare you. I purposefully took my passport and all the cards out of my wallet, except for the transportation card." Tears rolled down Irene's face. "I told the investigator 5 years ago that you never forgot your things. And he told me that everything happens for the first time. If only we had known that you were heading to the industrial zone on the boss's orders, the police would have had reason to interrogate him more closely. It would have helped the investigation, and you could have returned to us sooner." Carlos confessed, "I never thought it would go this far. I thought maybe it would end with a scuffle. I decided that after that, I'd quit the company and look for a new job. But I was outsmarted. So, I was approaching the truck with our logo on it, and someone hit me from behind. I woke up already tied up in a small booth of a van, as I determined from its size. Besides the blow, they seemed to have sedated me with something. I didn't have the strength to free myself from the ropes, my head wasn't working properly, and I just wanted to sleep instead of trying to escape from this situation. Later, I managed to find out that they were transporting me for at least a day. In the end, I got kicked out of the van in a strange place. It seemed to be a small enterprise, but fortified no worse than a medieval castle. The outer perimeter had a plain brick fence that wasn't remarkable, except that there was a sophisticated alarm system, as I later found out. There was only one entrance to the territory, and it was through a guardhouse. All passing and departing cars went through it. After a strip of hawthorn bushes that grew all around the perimeter, there was another fence. There was no subtlety here, barbed wire on top and a single gate. Perhaps even in a maximum security prison, things aren't so desolate and grim. There might not be guardhouses in the corners of the perimeter, but otherwise, it's worse than what they show in TV series. Through that single gate, all communication with the outside world took place. Cars didn't enter inside, and all loading and unloading happened through that door. Within this fortress was a barrack with a sewing workshop and a few greenhouses. They told me that I owed a lot of money to some serious people and they forced me to pay off with my housing. When I refused, they beat me up a bit and said that I would compensate with work then. Honestly, at first, I didn't take all of this seriously. I thought that such wild methods were a thing of the past, back in the 90s. But no, this prison was located far away from people. At least, there was no village noise like rooster crowing or cow mooing, and no noise from the highway either. No matter how much I listened, I couldn't hear any of that. When I first got there, we were a total of 8 prisoners, 3 women and 5 men. There was only one shower and toilet for all of us. Cots instead of beds, thin mattresses, and scratchy blankets. However, the supervisors were kind enough to maintain cleanliness. Perhaps they didn't want to deal with sick or infested inmates. Our duties varied. I was mostly sent to the greenhouse. Thank you, Mom, for teaching me all those tricks. Carlos raised his mug as if saluting Senora Gallego, who was sitting diagonally from her son on the couch, listening to him with the utmost attention. Thanks to my knowledge and skills, I sort of became the head of the agricultural section of this slave farm. Working in the greenhouse, of course, isn't a piece of cake, but under various pretexts, I managed to get a bigger ladder brought in, supposedly to check some suspicious slopes. Using the ladder, I realized that I was in a tough situation. Even the guards were lazily watching to ensure that no one else thought of slipping a note for help into the finished products. Regular prisoner, Suarez, who seemed like an old man but turned out to be my contemporary, told me that it used to happen. After the arranged punishment, only he and another woman remained alive. She wasn't around by the time I appeared in this hell. Suarez said that sometimes someone was taken out through the gate, but no one had returned. The people, in general, changed frequently, and after 3 years, I was the only one left from the initial group. They took Suarez out through the gate as well. After that, I seriously started considering escape. But to lower their guard, I even came up with a sort of rationing proposal for effective greenhouse use. Eventually, the main person in charge, whom we hadn't seen in person, became interested in my idea. In general, thanks to this outward docility, I gained quite a reputation. But in exchange for that, they didn't even allow me a single short call. And I really wanted to tell you even just a few words, so you wouldn't worry. Senora Gallego wiped away tears, and Irene, who had rushed to the kitchen, brought her more sedatives. The elderly woman gratefully patted her daughter-in-law's hand as she took the cup. After a pause, Carlos continued his difficult story. Remember, Mom, how Dad and I used to grow tulips for you? And you pretended not to notice when we whispered to each other. Well, with that same special feeling, I was engaged in growing flowers for International Women's Day. And I was contemplating how to put notes in the flower pots without smudging the text. Recently, a young girl, really quite young, ended up in our hell. Clumsy, couldn't sew, cook, or even tend to plants. Josefa didn't know how to do anything. However, the guards treated her indulgently, they didn't beat her like the rest of us, and they didn't torment her. Somehow, this Josefa started treating us decently, like we were regular people. She would occasionally ask everyone for sugar to share with her because she had a sweet tooth. But no one was in a hurry to cough up anything, but I really didn't mind. Then Josefa asked to work with me in the greenhouse, promised to help. The guards didn't object. If she wants to contribute, off she goes. The girl turned out to be crafty. She managed to swipe a phone from one of the overseers. While I distracted him, she somehow managed to send a message to someone. She quickly deleted it and returned the phone to its place. Fortunately, everything was happening in the greenhouse where there were no cameras. Otherwise, we would have been in big trouble. But a few days later, our prison was stormed by a group of masked individuals. How happy we were about that. However, Josefa didn't let me join the others who were being loaded into a van. She pulled me towards a separate car. Inside the car was her father, Don Reyes. Josefa had sent him a message asking for help, and he, using his connections, found out where his daughter was being held. They offered to let us stay with them while the investigation was ongoing, but I rushed home. Don Reyes lent me some money and offered to call my family, but I declined. I just wanted to see you right away. I arrived in the city, and there was a man who didn't even open the door for me. He told me that Irene was now living in the village. So, I rushed here. Irene sensed that Carlos had omitted many details, but seeing that her husband's eyes were drooping, she refrained from asking further questions. Perhaps even what he had shared was already too much, delving back into the troubled recent past. Mom, Irene, I think I'll go to sleep. My eyes are getting heavy, Carlos confessed. Sure, son, go ahead, Senora Gallego kissed her son as he leaned towards her. Rest, my golden boy. Irene received an almost friendly kiss on her cheek from her husband and didn't insist on keeping him company. Moreover, she still had to fulfill Doña Molina's task. She moved the sewing machine from the room where Carlos had already settled on the bed to the kitchen to keep the noise from reaching her resting husband and mother-in-law, and she began working. The excitement of seeing her beloved was making itself known, but after exhaling, she tried to focus on sewing. Soon, Doña Molina's pants were hemmed. Deciding not to disturb her husband's rest, Irene set an alarm on her phone to ensure she had time to prepare breakfast for everyone and not be late to see her employer. Then she settled on the small couch. In the morning, she woke up even before the annoying bird songs and hurried to Carlos's room. To confirm that he was there, right beside her. That everything that had happened yesterday wasn't a dream. Irene gently opened the door and smiled. Carlos was lying there as he loved, spread out like a starfish, gently dozing. She gazed at this sight, not even noticing as her mother-in-law approached her, who quietly confessed. Oh, Irene, I also came to see if our boy really returned. It's a shame that Daniel didn't live to see this bright day. Senora Gallego wiped away a tear that had rolled down from her sleep-deprived and recently tearful eyes, and advised. My dear, why don't you run to Kayushka's friend, Javi? Share the joy and ask him to take you there and back to the mistress. I don't think he'll refuse. Irene followed the advice, and soon, Javier was driving her to the cottage settlement in his father's car. Doña Molina was listening to the maid while simultaneously trying on the pants, then she clarified. So, Irene, you just want to leave today? You informed me of your decision quite late, and it'll be hard for me to find a replacement now. Let's at least have lunch, and then I'll let you go. In the meantime, focus on your duties. Afraid of losing her job, Irene agreed and went to inform Javier that he should go to the village alone. Drop by at my place, tell them I'll come after lunch. My mistress urgently needs something. Don't worry, Renita. I'll tell Aunt Gloria and Carlo everything. I'll have my own talk with that wanderer Carlos. Haven't seen him in so many years. Hey, maybe I should give you a ride? Or even better, I'll send my younger brother Alex over to you. He's got a gray Corolla, in case you forgot. Although Irene tried to focus on her work, it wasn't going well. She pondered how to approach her husband, who had been acting so distant. She wanted to shout about her happiness, and belatedly realized that she hadn't shared her joy with any of her close ones. Seizing a moment, Irene sent a message to Adelita and Yago, then muted her phone, anticipating a flurry of clarifying calls. Doña Molina couldn't stand it when her staff chatted during working hours. And losing her job now was out of the question. The state of Carlos's health was unknown, and it was uncertain how much time and money would be needed for his rehabilitation after years in captivity. Javi didn't disappoint. His working horse, a Toyota Corolla, which his brother used as a taxi, was waiting for Irene outside the cottage fence. As she approached her mother-in-law's house, Irene noticed two large unfamiliar cars in the yard. Obviously, guests had arrived, and she realized that they were here for Carlos. Her apprehension grew. It was clear that the visitors had nothing to do with law enforcement. Thanking Alex, who stubbornly refused to take money, Irene hurried to the door, but a man emerged from a strange car and blocked her way. "Excuse me, an important conversation is happening there." Irene wasn't intimidated. "You excuse yourself and step aside. My family is there, so get out of the way." The thug didn't move, but apparently his movements by the gate hadn't gone unnoticed in the house, and someone inside waved him off, allowing the woman to pass. Irene almost ran into the house and, leaning against the doorframe, froze at the sight before her. At the table next to Carlos sat a young girl, gently stroking his hand, radiating beauty and youth. Beside the stranger sat a solid-looking man and a woman whose striking appearance clearly indicated a kinship with the girl. Senora Gallego had her back to the door and didn't see her daughter-in-law. Her husband, however, gazed lovingly at the girl, who was telling everyone present, "If it weren't for Carlos, I would have probably gone crazy there. That place was a dump. The only sweet thing was sugar, not a single piece of chocolate the whole time. Let alone a manicure. Thankfully, Carlos took me under his wing. Without him, I doubt I would have escaped from there." The man smiled, not letting go of his neighbor's hand. That must be Josefa, Irene thought, and her hunch was immediately confirmed. "Peppa is exaggerating," Carlos gallantly chimed in. "Thanks to her, they found all of us and rescued us. I just had to distract the supervisor a bit. And then, Don Reyes, you know better than us. How you found that prison, how you organized this operation without exposing your plan to the corrupt cops who were overseeing everything there." Inside Irene, a cold feeling spread. Carlos looked at Josefa with loving eyes. It was evident that although he had escaped captivity, he didn't seem to intend to live with his lawful wife anymore. Irene understood that she was losing to a much younger, well-groomed rival in appearance. Moreover, Josefa and Carlos had gone through a shared trial that had clearly brought them closer. Not knowing what to do, Irene decided to simply greet them. With surprise, but seemingly from a distance, she noticed that Carlos didn't withdraw his hand, but instead offered, "Have a seat, get to know each other. This is Josefa and her parents, Enrique and Helena Reyes. They've come to visit my mom and express their gratitude for their son, so to speak." Senora Gallego turned around and, noticing the incredibly pale face of the bride, stood up and led her to an empty chair. "Sit down, my dear, I'll pour you some water." "Don't worry, Mom, I can handle it myself." Irene mustered a smile as best as she could, glancing at her mother-in-law, then directly asked Carlos, "You probably want a divorce, don't you?" The man only looked slightly embarrassed, then confessed, "Well, it would probably be too much to ask you for that. Don't misunderstand me, I'm very grateful for everything you've done for the well-being of my parents. But that's how it turned out. Don Reyes is persuading me to check into the hospital for a thorough examination today. With his permission, I've also suggested my mom get her health checked. After all, the trials she endured weren't easy." Senora Gallego raised her hands. "Oh, I keep saying it's all nonsense. Renita follows the doctor's orders, gives me the injections they prescribe, and looks after me in general." Doña Reyes, with a pleasant velvety voice, intervened, having apparently presented these arguments before, but now addressing them not to Senora Gallego, but to the newly arrived Irene. "You see, I don't want to question the doctor's prescribed tactics, but from the bottom of my heart, I suggest not refusing a comprehensive examination at a very reputable institution. There's no need to worry. This clinic provides excellent meals, and the medical staff is so impressive that some foreign institutions could envy. Don't refuse. Of course, we'll cover all the costs. You don't need to worry about that. Irene, well, you're a sensible woman, influenced Senora Gallego. She really should take care of her health. Besides, we'll try to arrange for Carlos to be close by. Positive emotions are a significant part of any therapy. Irene listened and bitterly smiled to herself. There he was, Carlos, alive and practically unscathed. He came back, but no longer as her husband, but as a stranger. And she couldn't do anything about it. Renita, why are you so silent? Carlos asked. The woman wanted to respond that she wasn't accustomed to displaying everything she felt in front of an audience. So, she simply stood up and announced, I'll go pack Senora Gallego's things, organize all the previous appointments, and prepare other documents. I think, Mom, it's best for you to see good specialists, she turned to her mother-in-law. She went to pack things together with her future mother-in-law and asked for forgiveness. My dear, sweet and kind girl. Please forgive me for not finding the strength to refuse. After all, Carlos is my son, and I couldn't kick his guests out of this house, which also belongs to him. It's all inhuman, abnormal towards you, but that's how life turned out. Forgive me, my dear. Irene embraced the woman, who was on the verge of tears, and tried to console her. You have absolutely no reason to apologize to me. All I ask is that you let me stay here a little longer to sort things out with my job. I don't want to disappoint the mistress, and finding help quickly, as she mentioned, isn't very easy. Senora Gallego hugged her daughter-in-law with all her might. Renita, my dear. You'd be doing me a huge favor if you stayed here. After all, someone needs to watch over the chickens, and we need to start planting the garden soon. You're our only hope, my dear. Carlos also took the opportunity, looking into the room where his mother was, to thank Irene discreetly. Thank you for not causing a scene. I probably wouldn't have been able to handle that. You're a wonderful person and deserve happiness. I'm very ashamed of how things turned out. Well, should we beat ourselves up about it now? You can despise me if you want, but there's nothing I can do. Forgive me. Irene raised her hand, brushed it along her husband's cheek in farewell. It's okay, Carlos, it's okay. The most important thing is that you're alive. Be happy. I won't put any obstacles in your way if you want a divorce, don't worry. I'm even willing to share the apartment so you can have your own living space in the city. You're not to blame for the terrible circumstances that interfered with our relationship. Go now, it's not nice to keep people waiting. Carlos shook his head negatively, managing to kiss Irene's hand. Don't talk nonsense, I'm not going to claim your apartment. I'm already indebted to you without that. Unable to bear the soul-wrenching dialogue any longer, Irene rushed out of the room, using the excuse of gathering the usual medicines for her mother-in-law, which were kept in the kitchen cabinet. She tried to avoid crossing paths with her husband as much as possible, answering all questions with one-word replies. The guests, however, didn't make much effort to engage her in conversation. Only Josefa, whether out of naivety or shock from the recent events, attempted to innocently ask some inconsequential questions. For example, how did the rooster know when to crow? Or why didn't Carlos's mother have a dog or at least a cat in the yard? Doña Reyes, seeing that her daughter was stressing out an already upset Irene, requested, Peppa, it seems to me that it's hot in here. Let's go sit in the car, where the air conditioning is working. Enrique, we'll wait for you outside, she turned to her husband. Pushing her daughter towards the exit, the woman bid farewell to Irene. Take care. Please don't hold a grudge against us. It's clear that you're a wonderful person. Believe me, this situation isn't easy for any of us. Following his wife and daughter, Enrique Reyes also exited. Goodbye, Irene. I left my business card on the table. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. I'll help as much as I can, of course. Thank you, was all Irene could manage to say. She didn't think that anyone in this world could help her right now. After receiving another indifferent and brotherly cheek kiss from Carlos, and an additional piece of advice from her future mother-in-law on where and when to plant what, Irene closed the door behind everyone and, collapsing to the floor, burst into tears. She was once again left on the sidelines of life. Exhausted from crying, she simply closed her eyes and listened to the sounds around her. The busy clucking of the chickens Sonora Gallego had let out into the yard, the barking of dogs somewhere in the distance, engaged in a not-so-human conversation, and the humming of a lawnmower filled the air. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine came to a halt as if right in front of Irene's suffering house. The knock on the door filled her with hope. She thought Carlos had returned to say he was wrong and had changed his mind. However, upon opening the door, she saw Adelaida and Iago standing on the porch, holding large bags with the logo of a city hypermarket. "Why are you alone and teary-eyed?" her cousin asked. "We rushed here with Mom. Looks like we managed to be late." "Irene, don't cry," her brother noted the tears that glistened in the corners of his sister's eyes. "Explain what happened. Where did our once-lost guy disappear to again? And where is Sonora Gallego? What on earth happened here?" Inviting her guests into the kitchen, Irene briefly recounted the recent events to her relatives while unpacking the bags and setting the table. Her hands were busy, and as a result, she managed to speak without breaking down or showing excessive emotion. Then she simply sat down on a chair, caught the scent of the food, grabbed a piece of sausage from the table, and began to eat it with enthusiasm. Only now did Irene realize that by skipping breakfast in the morning and only drinking a cup of coffee at Doña Molina's mansion, not tasting it due to her haste and desire to finish her duties and return to her mother-in-law's house, she had gone through the day without proper sustenance. "If I had known, I wouldn't have hurried," Irene murmured aloud. "I would have been happy for a few more hours. And now I'm completely alone, unwanted by anyone. My mother-in-law went away too, and put me in charge of looking after the household." Adelaida stared at the wall thoughtfully, then whispered quietly, "You know, Irene, I would have done everything I could to keep our Paco alive without hesitation. But it turned out that I couldn't do anything. Don't be mad at your mother-in-law. What mother would refuse to spend time with a child who returned from hell? I would have gone to hell itself, let alone an elite clinic." Adelaida fell silent. Iago also didn't say a word. He understood that the death of his older brother was still an open wound in their mother's heart and didn't know how to ease her pain. Irene didn't say anything either. After all, was it really a tragedy that Carlos's hard work and this girl from a seemingly well-off family helped him escape his captors? Perhaps if it weren't for her parents' connections, Carlos would have remained enslaved. He might even have disappeared forever. Would that have been better than his return to his mother's joy? Josefa wasn't to blame either for falling for a married man. Irene, perhaps more than anyone else, knew what a caring and tender person Carlos was. It was easy to fall in love with him. Of course, she was disappointed that, if you counted from the moment they met, fate only allotted them 3 years of happiness before tearing them apart. They were separated against their will. She should probably be happy Carlos did come back alive, as she had asked. She just didn't specify that his heart wouldn't belong to her anymore. As they say, be careful what you wish for. Or, more precisely, formulate your wishes in the most detailed way so that the mischievous hand of fate doesn't have room for unpleasant maneuvers. The soft light of the woven lampshade added coziness to the kitchen, and the melancholy silence that had settled in the small space was broken by Iago. "All right, ladies, let's have dinner. We need to restore our strength. Besides, there's no reason to be sad. Irene, you're starting a new phase of life. And my mom and I, you know, we're always here for you. Even if we're far away." Adelaida elegantly dabbed the corners of her eyes with a napkin and smiled. "Well said, Sonny. Nicely done. How about pouring us some juice? It's like we just had a toast, and our cups are empty." Irene sat and admired the woman who, essentially, had raised her. Beautiful despite the cruel trials, with a proud posture and a natural resilience. She was a true pillar for all family members. Even in those terrible moments when Irene had to shoulder all the household responsibilities on her still fragile shoulders, she mentally relied on Adelaida. She estimated how she would solve this or that problem. "Thank you so much for coming," Irene said. "Today would have been too heavy for me alone. I'm very grateful to you." "Oh, come on, little sister," Santiago said in a playful tone. "You know I'm always ready to run away from work, and Mom sometimes needs a break from serving her husband. Let Dario try to keep the warmth and comfort in the family hearth himself. It seems like he thinks it's too easy." Irene suspected that Yago's relationship with his stepfather wasn't going too well. His speech only confirmed her suspicions. Santiago's salary probably wouldn't be enough to rent an apartment. So the young man had to almost every day witness someone else taking his father's place. No matter how good Dario was, it was clear that Yago had a hard time accepting the situation. Irene couldn't fully imagine her brother's pain, but she tried to steer the conversation. "I'll go prepare sleeping arrangements for you. Adelaida, where would you prefer to settle, on my bed or on the couch in the living room?" The woman was pleased that Irene came to her aid and answered, "Irene, can I set up on the veranda? It seems like the nights aren't too cold now, and I really want to enjoy the fresh air." With Yago's help, moving the folding bed, mattress, and other essentials, Irene set up the sleeping arrangements. After they all wished each other a good night and tried to fall asleep, Irene attempted to sleep. It was in vain, as the last 2 days had been filled with too much news. She lay in bed, tossing and turning, waiting for the first rays of the sun to rise. Irene quickly prepared breakfast and tried not to make any noise. However, Adelaida and Santiago appeared in the kitchen fairly soon, wishing each other a good morning. Playing the role of the mistress in her mother-in-law's house, Irene, perhaps for the first time that morning, felt like she wasn't quite in her element. Like an imposter. Perceptive Adelaida sensed her mood and soothingly patted her hand. "My dear, believe that Senora Gallego's attitude towards you hasn't changed at all. For her, just like for me, you're the dearest daughter, strange as that may sound." These words were unexpected but pleasant for Irene. Suddenly, she started crying again and hugged Adelaida, whispering in her ear, "Thank you so much. You have no idea how important it is for me to hear this today." Adelaida wiped away Irene's tears and said, "Let's both calm down, okay? You need to go to work, and I do too. Our eyes are all watery." After breakfast, despite Irene's assurances that she could quickly make her way to the cottage community, Yago insisted, "No way, we'll take you there with Mom. Besides, let's think about your return to the city. Constantly being here as someone's servant in their mansion isn't your level, sis. After all the practice taking care of your mother-in-law, you're practically a nurse, just without the diploma. And you can sew too, don't be modest, you're fantastic. It's time, Irene, to return to the city. Senora Gallego has someone to take care of her now, and it's time for you to take care of yourself." On the same day, after saying goodbye to her relatives, Irene informed her employer, "Doña Molina, I'm sorry, but in a month, I'll have to leave you. I'll be returning to the city." The woman clearly wasn't pleased with this announcement from her hired worker, but she nodded regally. "All right, I've heard you. I'll start looking for a replacement. It would be nice if you could recommend someone. But if not, then so be it, I'll manage on my own. I hope you'll continue to perform your duties just as diligently as before, without thinking about your upcoming departure." Of course, Irene promised. The 3 weeks that Senora Gallego spent in the clinic, undergoing various tests, passed quickly and unnoticed. As if testing Irene's resilience, Doña Molina simply overwhelmed her with tasks. She hadn't sewn this much for her employer before. Curtains, dresses, skirts, blouses, everything was piling up on Irene in a never-ending stream. However, she welcomed the extra work. tending to the garden at her mother-in-law's, and then sitting at the sewing machine until dawn helped Irene forget and suffer less about the fact that she was about to become a divorcee at a certain age. Of course, 26 years weren't the end of life, but she couldn't quite be called a young beauty anymore. 2 vertical creases were already firmly planted between her eyebrows, and faint wrinkles were starting to fan out from the outer corners of her eyes, which didn't contribute to a fresh appearance. Well, whatever, beauty isn't everything, Irene thought, looking at herself in the mirror. After all, Carlos doesn't need me anymore, and I don't need to show off in front of anyone else. When Senora Gallego returned home with her son, she praised her future daughter-in-law. "Oh, you clever girl. You managed so skillfully. My sunshine, even though the clinic staff is well trained, no one administers injections as tenderly as you do. You truly have a calling." Carlos was about to leave immediately, but his mother insisted that he at least have some tea. "Don't forget, my boy, the doctors told you not to overexert yourself. So come, sit at the table with us." Irene tried not to stare at Carlos, who seemed to have become even more handsome than before. Especially since he was behaving with an overt calmness and calmly announced when his mother went to rest, tired from the journey. "Irene, I consulted with a lawyer on how to arrange everything so that there wouldn't be any division of assets during the divorce. And don't worry, I've already filed the paperwork and paid the fees, so you don't have to deal with the unpleasant process. In short, I apologize once again, okay? All right, no need to ask for forgiveness again and again. I'm leaving here for the city in a week, but until then, we need to decide who will take care of Senora Gallego. It's going to be tough for her to stay alone." Carlos smiled with a charming smile. "I'm planning to live here, Irene. Don Reyes offered me remote work, and I agreed. Peppa is supposed to come later. So, you don't have to worry about Mom. If needed, I'll ask a nurse to administer injections. Thank you, caring, lovely Irene, who is no longer mine. Please forgive me." Irene hurried to end the conversation, feeling tears welling up in her eyes again. A bit more brusquely than intended, she rushed to tidy up, pretending to wipe imaginary dust from the windowsill, and replied, "That's enough with the rosy nonsense, Carlos. We're parting ways, so let's do just that. And there's no need to keep asking for forgiveness endlessly." Irene had another week of work left with her employer, and during that time, she slept on the veranda, convincing Senora Gallego that she slept much better there. The almost former mother-in-law didn't object but requested, "Sweetie, just make sure you're warmly wrapped up. Summer has already begun, but it can still get chilly at night." Irene appreciated the care. She understood that Senora Gallego was saddened by her son's decision to divorce and was doing her best not to show her own disappointment. On the last working day, Irene received her full payment from Doña Molina, along with a bit more than expected and an explanation. "Maybe I've become sentimental, but I'd like to reward your patience somehow. You know, if you're not against it, when I'm in the city, I'll call you and bring some things for you to work on. You're just so good at this job." Irene thanked her. "Thank you, Doña Molina. I'll be looking forward to future meetings with you." On this pleasant note, Irene concluded another chapter of her life. Santiago and his friends, Joel and Martine, helped Irene move from the village to the city. Carlos, almost intentionally, went to visit a friend early in the morning, and Irene didn't blame him for it. She didn't want to strain herself, watching her almost ex-husband. Senora Gallego welcomed the helpers, continually inviting them to cold homemade lemonade, tasting salad with her homegrown greens, and eggs from her own hens. But the cheerful young men insisted that they would sit down to eat only after they had loaded Irene's belongings into the car. There weren't that many bags, boxes, and bundles, and before long, Senora Gallego could showcase her generous hospitality. After rising from the table following a late breakfast, both Irene and her cousin, Yago, along with his friends, were thoroughly satisfied. Yago respectfully bowed to the homeowner. "Heartfelt thanks, Senora Gallego. Everything you've made is incredibly delicious. You're simply amazing." The woman smiled. Oh, it's nothing. Truthfully, Renita did most of the cooking. I just set the table. Sonora Gallego's eyes were moist. After the men had left, as if sensing the need to leave the women alone, Irene turned to her beloved mother-in-law. I'm not saying goodbye, Mom. Call me anytime if you miss me. Come visit, I've already sent you the address. Until we meet again. The women hugged, and as Sonora Gallego waved her handkerchief at the departing car, she whispered, Good luck to you, dear. Thanks to Adelaida's constant vigilance, the tenants of Irene's new apartment were very careful, and there was no need for repairs or a thorough cleaning. So, as soon as Iago and his helpers brought in all the belongings, Irene began to arrange things in places that she felt suited them best. The men were more of a hindrance than help in this task, but Irene didn't rush to shoo them away. She wasn't feeling very comfortable emotionally, and she patiently gave them instructions to take things to the kitchen or the bathroom. When most of the boxes were sorted out, Irene suddenly asked the men to do a small rearrangement. She didn't want the apartment's layout to remind her of the brief times when she lived here with Carlos. This request was swiftly fulfilled, and after looking around contentedly, Irene mused aloud without addressing anyone in particular. Well, happy housewarming, right? Iago peered into the fridge and whistled. Wow! Mom brought enough food to feed an army. So, there's plenty to celebrate my sister's move. Irene immediately supported the idea. Exactly, Iago, well done. I didn't think of that right away. I'll call your mom now. Are you okay if I invite Dario too? It feels a bit awkward otherwise. Santiago waved his hand. Well, it's your place now, you're the hostess. And, in general, Dario isn't a bad guy. I just find it difficult to have him in the apartment where the walls hold memories of happy days with Dad. I don't think such associations will arise here. Martine and Joel wanted to leave, but Iago didn't let them. What are you guys doing? We work together, so we celebrate together. No way around it. Irene agreed. Absolutely, in fact, there's so much food in the fridge that each of you can take some home too. There are even 2 cakes Adelaida really outdid herself. The housewarming celebration was joyful and fun. Irene and Adelaida, surrounded by the quartet of men, felt like queens. They were invited to dance non-stop, and everyone laughed heartily when Iago suggested playing charades. Irene noticed that Martine was looking at her too often with exaggerated attention, but she didn't take those looks seriously. Who knows what might have caught his interest? The idea that she might be appealing to him as a potential life partner was immediately rejected by the woman. Irene no longer believed in love at first sight from a few glances. Besides, she was no longer the naive girl who had fallen head over heels in love with a stranger. Amidst the festivities, the intercom buzzed, and to Irene's surprise, she recognized Carlos's voice. I'm sorry, can I come up to get my things? Without hesitation, Irene pressed the button to unlock the door. Of course, Carlos. Thanks to Adelaida, everything is packed and waiting for you on the enclosed heated balcony. By Carlos's appearance, it was easy to guess that he didn't expect to see Irene surrounded by a cheerful company. He didn't say anything and, after picking up 2 large suitcases and a laptop bag, left. The celebration continued, and the games were replaced by physical activities again. While twirling Irene in another dance, Iago announced, If you're curious, I think Carlos will soon regret his decision to break up with you. The impression you made on my guys was just off the charts. Mishka can't take his eyes off you. Even Ilyasha, despite being married, is keeping an eye on you. Irene's melancholic mood significantly improved. It was nice to be interesting to someone. Besides, looking at her family now, she realized that she truly had a support system in her life. Of course, there were still many challenges ahead related to adapting to new realities and finding a job. But now Irene wasn't scared anymore. Without money for rent, things might not be easy, but she would find a way, just like she always did. Moreover, as Carlos had informed her, Don Reyes had paid off the entire mortgage. He explained that Josefa's father had sympathized with her situation and had given her the money to pay off the remaining debt to the bank. It was hard to think of a more valuable housewarming gift. So, it seemed that life was truly falling into place. While the prospects of finding work were still unclear, Doña Molina had hinted that she might have some orders for her. "I'll manage somehow," Irene declared, dancing with Martín. As everyone started to disperse, the hostess of her old new apartment was almost exhausted and sincerely thanked her helpers. "If it weren't for all of you, I probably wouldn't have been able to do anything. Thank you so much." Adeleda winked at Irene. Well, what else are relatives and friends for if not for working and relaxing together? It was clear to her that her late husband's niece had made a good impression on Martín. Adeleda desperately wished that Irene wouldn't rush to reject the considerate and kind man who was once a classmate and now her son's colleague. Of course, rushing into a relationship as revenge against Carlos was not the right approach either. But letting go of someone like him would be a mistake. However, Adeleda literally bit her tongue to keep from giving unsolicited advice and simply hugged Irene tightly. The men were already on the stairwell, and with a mischievous smile, Adeleda advised, "Before you go to sleep, don't forget to say the old saying, sleeping in a new place, dream of a groom for the bride." Irene burst into laughter. Adeleda, "Oh, you're making me laugh. But what about the fact that I've lived in this apartment before and I'm still Carlos's legal wife? Good one, future bride. Not only am I married, but also, like in humor classics, young is not actually young." Adeleda gave Irene a kiss and, waving her hand, hurried to join the men who had managed to call the elevator. She shouted farewell. "Still, give it a try, Irene." Snorting, Irene closed the door. It was good that she had Adeleda and Yago. They had organized such a celebration for her and even spared her the cleaning chores by setting the table with tablecloths and dishes. And at the end of the evening, they simply gathered all the unnecessary items into a large garbage bag and took them with them. All Irene had to do was take a shower, washing away the exhaustion of the eventful day, and dive onto the couch under a fluffy terry sheet instead of a blanket. After texting Senora Gallego that the move had gone smoothly, the woman, who was already on the brink of sleep, put her phone aside and mumbled the proverb suggested by Adeleda. Not that Irene seriously wanted to get married again, but why not have a little innocent fun? Irene dreamed of a rich fruit garden where she wandered, experiencing an incredible sense of tranquility. Something that was unattainable for her in reality. She inhaled the aroma of ripe apples and pears, but didn't dare to pick any fruit. Irene kept walking and walking, captivated by the beauty of the serene landscape, and suddenly heard a male voice. "Do you really want to try it? Do you want an apple or a pear?" Even before turning around, Irene already guessed that it was Martín who was talking to her. And she responded to him, inexplicably, with uncharacteristic playful irony. "Actually, I'd like to try a peach. But it seems there's no peach tree around here." In response, Martín took her hand firmly and led her somewhere, carefully moving aside the branches that blocked the way. Soon Irene smelled the scent of peaches and then saw a tree covered with fruit. Martín picked the ripest one and handed it to her. After a brief pause, she accepted it, and the smiling man spun her in a dance. At this point, Irene's dream ended, and she even shook her head, dispelling either the remnants of sleep or the strange romantic thoughts. "Danced myself to swollen legs, gosh," she said aloud. This dream was a slightly altered memory of something that had happened recently in reality. There were juices on the table, including peach juice. That's why the dream turned out to be so fruity. And yes, she danced with Martín, that's it. The real-life scenario morphed into a dream. She won't believe that her future fiancé appeared in her dream. However, Irene's mood was great, and first and foremost, she decided to find some fabric for her summer wardrobe at the nearest store. There wasn't any specific idea in her mind, and she found a certain charm in that too. Maybe, while considering different options, she would come up with the thought of sewing a sundress with ruffles on the straps. Even though it might not be very trendy, it looked so touching and delicate. Or perhaps the fabric she saw would inspire her to sew a stylish jumpsuit. Or something in a free-spirited boho style. Predicting it was nearly impossible. One thing was clear, entering a new life in old jeans was definitely not an option. Thanks to Doña Molina, Irene had the money. She could even afford the luxury of taking a few days or perhaps a whole week off. Yes, a week. No less. Just like the wise rabbit from the good old cartoon used to say. Hastily getting ready, Irene, in high spirits, headed to the store. However, she found that over the past few years, there had been changes, and the familiar place was now occupied by a chain grocery store. Irene asked the saleswoman about where to find a fabric store and received a rather vague answer. It seems that we don't have such a store nearby in our area. Thanking the cashier and paying for the chosen water, Irene left the store and sat down on a bench, pondering where to go next. Inquiries from passers-by helped her locate the nearest fabric store, and soon she was intently studying the fabrics displayed in the windows. Fortunately, the store consultants were unobtrusive. Irene strolled calmly through the hall, mentally trying on different styles and colors. In this environment, she felt like a fish in water. And, perhaps due to the fact that she was dressed in a white formal blouse, reminiscent of a salesperson, even a young girl approached her for advice. "Could you please help me find a fabric that doesn't require special care? You know, something that doesn't shed while I'm sewing and doesn't wrinkle much when worn. And also, it shouldn't stick to my legs. Oh, and of course, it has to look good on me." Smiling, Irene guided the stranger to a stand with suitable fabrics and offered several options for her to choose from. The girl looked at them for a long time and then confessed, "I have almost no sewing experience, but my soul is just craving to create something. You understand?" Irene nodded. "I absolutely understand. Creative people often feel that way." The girl blushed. "Oh, I'm not that creative, but I want to impress a guy, and he appreciates everything unconventional. So, mass market clothes are out of the question. And I can't afford things from boutique stores either. Plus, I need the fabric to be practical and fabulous at the same time, you know?" Irene handed the girl a corner of one of the fabric samples. "Look in the mirror. In my opinion, this is what you need. If you're looking for a style suggestion, I think you should sew a skirt shorts. It's unique and comfortable. And the fabric seems perfect for this idea. I think it will turn into a gorgeous item. It will go well with any tank top or blouse." The girl's eyes lit up. She could already imagine herself triumphantly presenting herself to the guy she wanted to impress. Irene helped her calculate the necessary amount of fabric, reminded her to wash the fabric before cutting, and suggested she ask the salesperson for assistance in making the purchase. "Why can't you do it yourself?" The girl wondered. "I actually feel more comfortable with you. I'm an introvert, but you don't bother me. With you, I've opened up." "Well, let's go together to make the purchase then," agreed Irene, who didn't want to disappoint the girl by revealing that she was just another customer herself. Of course, the truth eventually came out, but fortunately, the purchase was still made. Holding the bag with the fabric, threads, buttons, and a matching zipper close to her, the girl thanked Irene again and hurried off to start her creative endeavor. The sales consultant smiled. "You're quite the professional. You were so enthusiastic in your explanations that we didn't even want to interfere. Although, technically, it's our job." Irene apologized. "I'm sorry, it just happened. Please give me the same fabric, but in a different color. Also, these buttons and the zipper, please." With her purchases, Irene hurried home, and by evening, after washing and drying the fabric, she began cutting her new outfit. In a few days, the work was completed, and she proudly admired herself in the mirror. Why did she ever think she was getting old? The reflection showed that she was still looking quite good. An unexpected phone call interrupted Irene's contemplation of the finished sundress. It was Adelaida on the line, offering Irene a job as a sales representative. She didn't refuse the offer and gradually adapted to her new responsibilities. It was unfamiliar territory, but the sheer volume of information kept her from getting bored or feeling lonely. Moreover, almost every week, Iago and Martine would visit her, taking her out for walks or to the movies. Iago, her cousin, would often come up with various excuses to leave her alone with Martine. At first, his not-so-subtle behavior annoyed her, but eventually, it began to amuse her. She realized that her relationship with Martine was evolving towards a romance, but she didn't rush events. She liked him, but she wasn't in a hurry to confess her feelings. As the end of the departing summer approached, Senora Gallego invited Irene to her birthday party and confessed. "You know, I'll probably understand if you decline, but I would really love to see you. I terribly miss you." Touched, Irene promised to come and began contemplating gift ideas and outfit choices for the celebration. The gift issue was resolved fairly quickly. However, sewing a new dress became a challenge due to her busy work schedule, orders from Doña Molina, and her acquaintances. She hardly had any time. Nonetheless, she didn't want to attend the party in jeans or strict office attire. Over a few sleepless nights, Irene managed to sew a comfortable dress that was neither too flashy nor restricting. After all, she knew she wouldn't be able to resist helping Senora Gallego. Martine didn't want to let Irene go to visit her former mother-in-law alone and asked, "How about I drive you there? I'll wait for you to celebrate and then take you back?" Irene didn't have any objections because she couldn't imagine how she would manage staying under the same roof as her ex-husband. Besides, Carlos would probably be with Josefa. In these circumstances, spending the night at Senora Gallego's house might not seem entirely proper. Martine declined to attend the actual celebration to avoid making the situation even more tense. As Irene had anticipated, the party was a bit strained. But the birthday girls seemed happy, and that was a relief. Carlos and Josefa, judging by the visibly rounder figure of the young woman, were expecting their first child. Surprisingly, this didn't trigger any negative emotions. Whatever feelings Irene once had for her husband were now in the past. Left alone for a moment, Carlos confessed, "I deeply regret how foolishly things fell apart between us." Irene shrugged, saying, "You know, when I was desperately begging everyone who had any power over fate to keep you alive and bring you back, it never occurred to me to specify that you should return to me. So, I have no complaints." After that confession, Irene felt a bit awkward herself. She hurriedly said her goodbyes to everyone present, congratulated Senora Gallego once again, and with relief, got into Martine's car. "That's it. Sorry I took so long. I couldn't leave too quickly." Martine smiled. "Don't worry, I'm ready to wait for you as long as it takes." The next encounter between the former spouses took place a few years later. Carlos brought Josefa, who was expecting their second child, to the maternity ward. In the waiting room, he encountered Martine and Irene, who had come for medical assistance in welcoming their firstborn into the world. After exchanging polite greetings, both couples quickly forgot about the awkwardness of the situation, as their concern for the future of their little ones overtook all past events. With only a few hours' difference, Carlos and Josefa welcomed their second son, while Martine and Irene became parents to a daughter. The discharge of Carlos's and Josefa's newborn coincided on the same day. As she watched her ex-husband and his wife, Irene silently thought, "How lucky that you're still alive after all." Then, after kissing Martine and handing him a bundle with their daughter, she asked him to hurry up and take them home.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe.